Discursive oral genres in professional and academic fields. Ken Hyland, probably the foremost expert in academic English, has compared the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, etc., with the social sciences and humanities. The differences that we see here on the slide are not always as clear cut. For example, in the humanities, a lot of empirical research is carried out, and both qualitative and quantitative research is found. There is also a continuum regarding written and spoken academic discourse, and the differences are becoming more and more blurred. Here we see several written and spoken genres, some of which we have already seen. In what follows, we will be using Andy Gillette's work, although we have adapted it to our own purposes. In general, academic discourse is formal. In general, this means that when speaking, we avoid colloquial words and expressions. However, formal discourse is becoming more and more conversational. Explicit, making the organization of the talk clear to the audience through the use of discourse markers, for example, is something that we should do so that they can follow us more easily. We should be precise when giving definitions and facts and figures. We should be as accurate as possible. Hedging. This has to do with the strength of our statements. We do not always have all the facts. All studies have some limitations. We will be looking at hedging in detail later on. You and I, we are all responsible for the claims that we make, and we normally make them in public in front of strangers many times. So it's very important to remember that we have a great deal of responsibility. We should always try to use vocabulary that accurately describes what we are talking about. As Gillette says, linguistics distinguishes clearly between phonetics and phonemics. General English does not. Academic discourse is more objective than subjective. The emphasis is on the information we are presenting rather than on ourselves. This applies to both written and oral discourse. However, speakers often introduce a few personal anecdotes to break the ice. Discretion is advised. Spoken language has fewer nominalizations. For example, instead of saying several factors should be taken into consideration, in spoken discourse we might say we should consider several factors. Of course, if we read from slides, we will probably mimic the written text. In any case, this is a recommendation rather than something written in stone. We often use more pronouns as we may refer to the audience and to ourselves, especially when we are explaining what we are going to do. If we use the active rather than the passive voice, we use more pronouns too. We tend to repeat words more often in talks to add emphasis or to link to new sentences. This is frowned upon in written academic discourse, but it's okay in spoken discourse. More active verbs than in written language. For example, instead of the victims were informed by the authorities, we might have the authorities informed the victims. Spoken discourse is more fragmented. We often use shorter clauses, fewer subordinates, and it is more common to go back to what we have said earlier for emphasis, or, for example, to point to slides. All this adds to greater fragmentation than what we see in written texts. Lexically less dense. For example, instead of he conducted research, we may simply say he researched. Instead of they made a decision, we can cut this down to they decided. There is also less use of complicated noun phrases. Redundancy. We might use a synonym or metaphor or simile to get our ideas across better. This kind of redundancy is something we might not do in written language, but it is okay in spoken discourse, of course within limits. Disfluencies. We often hesitate and use fillers such as you know, but once again, within reason, this is quite acceptable. There are definitely more interpersonal characteristics in spoken discourse. Speakers often talk directly to the audience or ask questions, for example.